I am glad that you are with us today, whether you are in this room or you are joining us online. And I just so love that technology because we have a growing online people that are joining us and following along as we read through the Bible together, God's story together. And if you're just now jumping on board, that is great. We're glad to have you. We want to make sure that we get a copy of the book, the resource that we're using, The Story, in your hands, and we want you to join with us. And if you've been with us for a while, you'll know that we have been making our way through what in your Bible is known as the Old Testament, and we're going to have a few more in that. But in 2 weeks, we begin the story of Jesus proper in the New Testament, and you're going to get to be a part of that. So now is a great time to jump on board if you haven't been on board yet. And it's also, if you've been with us, it's also a great time if there's somebody in your circle of influence that you have yet to reach out to and say, I think that you could use this. I think you would be blessed by this. I think you'd be encouraged by this. Let's get them a book. You extend the invitation, and let's get them in reading along with us as we dive into the Jesus part of the story. The whole thing's about Jesus, but it becomes Jesus very clearly because we'll hit the New Testament in just a couple of weeks, and so definitely want you to be a part of that. One of our visions is, as you heard MJ pray for today, is that we want everyone to lead someone else into faith, and you inviting them to be a part of the story. God's epic story is a way to do that, and so I'm going to challenge you to do that and be involved in that. Well, today we are coming into one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. And this thing reads so well. This is like a modern play. This reads incredibly well as far as a story. And so when you go to read chapter 20 this week, you're going to just love chapter 20 because I know there's some other chapters that's been difficult to kind of put all the pieces together because it's pulling from different biblical sources. Well, when you read chapter 20, it all comes from the book of Esther. And Esther tells the story that occurs about 100 years after God's people were allowed to start returning from exile. They'd been in exile. They'd been taken from their home for 70 years. And then there's this process of allowing them to return. There's a couple of waves of them coming back. Well, the Esther story picks up about 100 years later, and it also doesn't focus on what's going on in Jerusalem because some of those that were in exile, they continue to live out their lives in the places where they had now settled in these exile lands. And so this story takes place not in Jerusalem, but in Susa, which turns out to be the capital of the Persian Empire. And there are four main characters that I want you to pay attention to as we go through the story. So I'm going to give you the quick highlight now, then I'm going to share the story and then draw some conclusions from the story. But the first one is Xerxes. Now, what you need to know about Xerxes, other than that he's got a really, really awesome, cool name, okay? I'm thinking this would be a good name. Xerxes Meyer. If we had more children, maybe. I don't know. But Xerxes is the king of the empire, of this Persian empire. So what you need to understand about him is there is nobody in his mind more powerful than him, and nobody else on earth other than the faithful think there's anything more powerful than him. And he rules. Now you're going to see in the story that he's also easily swayed. When you kind of get him liquored up a little bit, you can have a lot of influence over with him. But the next person you need to understand is Mordecai. Now Mordecai is a Jew. He's part of God's people. Remember, he is not living back home in Jerusalem. He's living in one of the provinces controlled by now King Xerxes in this Persian Empire. And Mordecai has an adopted daughter. It's actually his cousin that he adopted, but he raises this young girl that lost her parents, and her name is Esther. And she's a central figure in this story. And then the villain of the story is a person that Xerxes raises up to be with lots of power and lots of influence, and some would say almost the second in the land, and this is Haman. And with that set, those are the characters that you're going to encounter in chapter 20. There's some more, but those are the ones that are going to carry the story forward. Because when the story opens, you're going to see that what Xerxes is doing is Xerxes is throwing a national party. They are celebrating the fact that the Persian Empire has now extended to new reaches. And so Xerxes throws throughout the empire this celebration, this national celebration that goes on for 6 months, 180 days. And it has flag waving, and it has parades, and it has celebrations, and I'm sure there are speeches, and there is backyard barbecues going on, but there all across there is this focus on the national pride of what it meant to be part of the Persian Empire. And so all of the different conquered regions and provinces and areas and people were supposed to be caught up in this. You see, it's a rally cry that isn't it good to be part of the empire now? And at the conclusion of that, after the 180 days, Xerxes, who apparently doesn't get tired of a good party, decides to throw a party, kind of an after party, for all those in his court. And that's a lot of people there in the capital of Susa. And he's going to throw that for a week. And I think it was kind of the deal like if you've put on a big production or play and then the cast have the wrap-up party at the end of the production. This is that. Maybe it was a way to say thank you to all of his court that had worked so hard to see the 6-month public celebration had been so wonderfully carried out. Well, he tells them at the party, he says, drink all you want, there are no restrictions. And so everybody's having a really good time at the party. At the same time, while he's throwing his party, his queen, Queen Vashti, is throwing a party for all the women of the court. So you have these two major parties going on. Near the end of the week, King Xerxes, again, he's feeling, he's the life of the party. He's the king. He's in the middle of it all. He wants to show off his trophy wife of the queen, Vashti. And so he summons her, says, I need you to show up. I want everybody to see how pretty and awesome you look. And when word gets to her, she knows what's going on. She knows she's just going to be eye candy and be oogled at and stared at by a bunch of drunk men, and she doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And so she says, no, I'm not coming. Well, that may not sound like a big deal to you or to me, but in that day, that sent King Xerxes into a rage. Now, I'm not defending him, but just for a second, get into his mindset. He sits as the absolute authority of an empire that covers the known earth. Nobody says no to King Xerxes. And so he circles up with his bros, gets them all around and says, what do I need to do about this? And they say, you got a problem, king, because if you let this happen, word's going to get out that when the king summoned the queen, she refused to come, and it's even, you're going to find this in the text, and that's going to signal every woman that they don't have to listen to their man. That's a problem. You can see the guy think going on in this, right? So what you need to do, king, is you need to put a stop to this real quick, and you need to exert your authority, and so you need to banish her from your court, never see her again, and then issue an edict that all women have to listen to their men. He says, that's a good idea. He's liquored up. And that's what happens. Well, unfortunately for him, now he's got another problem. He doesn't have a queen. And the king needs a queen. And so what he says is, let's have a beauty pageant that goes throughout all the empire. And he sends out his representatives, and they scour the empire. It didn't matter what part of the empire. And they were looking for any good-looking young woman. And they come across Esther. And they recruit Esther. And when they recruit Esther, her adopted father, Mordecai, gives her one morning and says, hey, I don't know where this is going to go, but for your sake and for ours, do not reveal to them that you're Jewish, that you're of God's people. Just keep that to yourself. And she listens to his counsel, and she goes through a series of beauty treatments and spa treatments, and this goes on for months and months and months. And there's this preparation for her, and then the king begins to summon them. And I don't know if he summoned them in batches or one at a time. I don't know if he gave them a rose like on The Bachelor or what. But he's having this little contest, and he lays eyes on Esther, and he's smitten by her. She is a good-looking woman that has now had 12 months of the best spa and beauty treatments known to man at the time. And he's just taken by her. And through whatever process, he says, that's the queen. And she moves into the royal court. This orphan Jewish girl moves in to the royal court. And that brings Mordecai close by because he stays around. I don't know if he's playing the father-in-law part or what, but he stays at least close by. And so that puts him at least in the hallways of the royal court. And as she is becoming the queen and he's around, Mordecai, this faithful Jewish man, hears of a plot between two of the king's guards that they're going to overthrow and assassinate the king. And being faithful and loyal, Mordecai does the right thing and he reports the guards. And somehow it makes it to the king, and the king obviously once again is enraged, and so he has these guards, and whoever else is involved in the plot to overtake him has him impaled upon these long poles. But the king either forgets, or it was never actually told to him because somebody else maybe took the claim for it, that Mordecai was involved in this. And so life just kind of goes on. And Esther enjoys the luxuries of the palace. And then comes our villain of the story, Haman. Haman begins to rise up, and he enters, and Xerxes gives him more and more and more power. And what Haman wants is he wants everybody to understand how awesome he is. He is totally sold on himself. And so Haman begins this process of attaching himself to all the king's glory and taking any that he would for himself. In fact, when the king makes him supposedly second in command, he sends an edict out to honor Haman and says that everybody will see him and bow down to him as a way of saying, this is the one that I choose. And so everywhere Haman goes, perhaps it was a gathering of this incredible court in front of him, but everyone bows down. As he goes into the streets, everyone bows down, all except for one person, Mordecai. Mordecai will not bow down to another man because he serves God. Now, the nation is bowing down to Haman. But his ego has so got him wrapped up that he cannot stand the fact that there's somebody out there that does not bow down. And he becomes fixated and frustrated with with Mordecai. Haman is just completely fed up with him. And so it becomes so enraging to him that he not only wants to get back at Mordecai, but he wants to get back at their entire people. He's aware that Mordecai is a Jew, and that enrages him because he realizes they serve a God that's supposedly higher than above him, and he is just angered by that. And so through deception, he sort of swaggers the king, Xerxes, into entrusting him with the authority to wipe out the Jews. He goes to the king and says something. There's a group of people that do not submit to your authority. And king, if you would let me, I would be happy to take care of this problem for you. He even offers to pay for the campaign to wipe these people out. And the king even says, no, you don't have to pay for it, but let's just make sure it all happens in one day. Let's don't drag this out. Happens in one day. And they roll a dice, they cast lots for it, and a day is chosen through this casting of lots for about 11 months later. And the edict is written up, and it's written to all the languages and sent to all 127 provinces that on this day, you can exterminate the Jews. You can attack the Jews without consequence from the king. Well, Mordecai gets word of this. And you can imagine just the grief and the burden that put on him. Because not only is just the tragedy of it all, but Mordecai is probably very much aware that it was his defiance that triggered this consequence. And he doesn't regret his defiance, but he's burdened by it, and he realizes that his people are facing an annihilation in the Persian Empire. And so what does he do? He puts on sackcloth and he rubs ash on his face. And this was the way that you just mourned and grieved in that time. But if you were like that, you couldn't approach the king. And so he's outside in the courtyard or outside the gates. And some servants of Esther, the queen, see him. And they take word back to Esther and they say, Mordecai is grieving at the gates. And she doesn't know why. She has no idea why. Now, understand how important that is, because she doesn't understand that the edict has gone out. It's gone to all 127 provinces, but she is unaware because palace life has insulated her from some of the consequences. She is very comfortable right now. So she sends the servant to Mordecai to find out why. And Mordecai tells her about the edict, and he sends the word back to the servant. And what Mordecai tells her is, you've got to act on this. And so he sends the word back. This is them sending like early text messages back and forth. The servant gets tired going back and forth. But Mordecai sends back word that here's what's at stake, and you need to do something about this. And that gives us some of the most famous words in the book of Esther that you probably have heard before. But here's that conversation. Esther chapter 4, and I'm just going to look at 14 through 16. And this is what Mordecai is sending back to Esther. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. You've come to your royal position this. Why? Because Esther is saying, I can't go talk to the king. It doesn't work that way. You don't just show up unannounced to King Xerxes. He has to summon for me, and he hasn't summoned for me in a month. I don't get to just approach him. And he says, if you remain silent, notice what he says, there will be deliverance in another way. But don't think that you're going to escape this. But for such a time as this, you've probably come to your royal position. What will you do? Well, when that word comes back to Esther, it reaches her heart. And she understands what she needs to do. And here's her response. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. She understands what's at stake. But she also understands that she needs to do what's right. And I love the little part where she says, here's what I need you to do. I need you to fast for me, and I'm going to fast too. And just a quick aside, that's a really good idea anytime you're facing a difficult conversation or a difficult decision. That you would rally people with you, people that you trust and have conviction in, and ask them and invite you into that prayer process and that fasting process for your courage and for your discernment. And that's what she's asking. Will you do this for me? And so ultimately she goes to the king and she sets up this banquet. And she says, King Xerxes, I want you to come to a banquet. And he is so pleased with her that he accepts and says, you can come in to my court. It's okay if you interrupt me, especially if you're going to throw a banquet in my honor. And so he welcomes her in because remember, he loves a party. And she says, well, this is kind of a unique banquet. I just want you, and why don't you invite Haman to join us as well? And so hey, Haman, you're free tomorrow night? We're having a banquet. Well, Haman walks out just proud because all he knows is that the king has just invited him to hang out with him and the queen in this very exclusive banquet. And on the way out, he sees Mordecai. And he is frustrated all over again. Again, he's just so proud, and yet he sees Mordecai, and now he's frustrated. And so he goes home, and he gets his guys together, and he talks to his wife, and he says, what am I going to do? What am I going to do about Mordecai? And the suggestion comes, what you need to do is you need to build one of those tall poles, and then you need to go back and use your goodwill with Xerxes to say, we need to impale Mordecai on this pole. And Haman likes the idea. This is a violent idea, but he likes this idea. And so the next day, he's headed in, and he's got this idea that he's about to pass on to the king. Here's what we need to do, king, because he's feeling good about this. And the king, he doesn't know, has had a very sleepless night. And during the night, when he couldn't sleep, King Xerxes did something a little strange. He said, I want you to read to me from the journal. And he goes and they get a journal where it just accounts different things that have happened in his court over the years. I mean, it's just the entries to it that he's reading. And he comes across the fact that Mordecai was the one that had uncovered the plot to assassinate him. And this not only doesn't help him sleep, he just kind of bolts up and says, what did we ever do for Mordecai? I didn't realize that he was the one. How did we show honor to him? And the journal reader says, you didn't. And so the next day, Haman is walking in, and the king, before Haman can speak, the king says, hey, I have a question. And here's what his question is, chapter 6 of the story. When Haman entered, the king asked him, the king is asking Haman, hey, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now, this is like a perfect movie script. Because Haman immediately thinks, oh, well, you're talking about me. And so he's going through, because he doesn't know that the king's been up all night reading the journal and hearing about Mordecai. Now, Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Pause. If all of your questions like that inside your head end with you as the answer, you may want to rethink. Back to the sermon. So he answered the king. Well, so his mind is spinning. What do I ask for? I mean, this is like, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, and this is what I want you to shout, this is what's done for the man the king delights to honor. So the king says, "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe, get the horse, do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew." Now, I wish that we had pictures to go along with the Bible to see Haman's face at this moment, who sits at the king's gates. Do not neglect anything that you've recommended. I want the whole list. And that's what Haman does. He has to go and get Mordecai. Put him on the horse that he thought was intended for him. Put the robe on him that he thought was intended for him. And be the one that leads him around shouting, "This is what the king delights in." I'm guessing he probably didn't shout it at the top of his lungs. He was probably a little passive-aggressive at that moment. He finishes that up. He goes, I guess he cleans up, and he goes to the banquet that night. And at the banquet, the king is asking Esther, "What is it that you want to ask of me?" And she says, "There is a plot against my people to annihilate them, and I'm grieving for it." And the king hasn't connected the dots. He doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. He's like, "What are you talking about? Who has done this against you?" She says, "It's Haman that's done this against the Jewish people." And the king goes off in a rage. He can't even be in the room for a moment. He's got to get out, I guess, collect his thoughts. So he goes out into his garden, and Haman knows that this whole plan is up. And he knows that the king has already decided his fate, and he begins to beg Esther. And the king comes stomping back in, and when he's doing that, he sees Haman begging Esther, but he mistakes it as he's trying to molest Esther, that he's trying to abuse her. And so he just flies all over the place and says, "Take him away." And they cover his eyes, they cover his face, and they drag him out. Somebody says, "What should we do with him?" And somebody says, "Well, outside of his house is a real tall pole to be impaled upon." And Xerxes says, "Impale him on it, and his family." And all that was Haman's is now taken and given to Mordecai. And the king cannot undo the edict that he sent out. And you're going to read that in chapter 20. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them, which is just a simple deal of if the king kept changing his edicts, that would make him look weak. Because the idea is that when the king spoke, it was the law. When the king spoke, it was the command. When the king spoke, that's the way it was, irrevocable. And the second problem is, too, understand this isn't where you can just make a public service announcement and send it out over text messages, because all these had to be finally copied and sent with the king's seal to all the different districts far and wide. And what you wouldn't want is you wouldn't want to have two competing, canceling each other out, because you wouldn't know which one you could trust. And so what Xerxes does is he sends out a whole new edict that on the day that we've given permission for everybody to wipe out the Jews have permission to fight back, to organize and fight back. Well, suddenly now you've got the problem of a resistance, and they're emboldened. And so when it's all said and done, instead of receiving harm, they actually take ground, because they fight back and they take from Haman's family and they take some other places, and now they're empowered. And so Mordecai is elevated to basically second in the land Haman's slot. Anyway, it ends this way. Esther chapter 9 says this: Mordecai recorded these events. He sent the letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar. As the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration, he wrote them to observe the days as a day of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Mordecai writes all this down, and now we know about the events of Esther and the feast that became something. They started celebrating a feast called Purim, and Purim refers to the lot that was cast. And this became a story that has guided the Jewish people for all these centuries now, in the celebration of the redemption that's come. I want to give you 3 quick takeaways from this that I want to challenge you with from Esther and Mordecai's life. Here's the first one. Just because God is silent does not mean he is absent. You will learn that Esther is the only book in the entire Bible that does not mention the name of God. God goes unmentioned through the book, but you can see him at work all through the way. From the fact that at a very early young age, Mordecai steps in and adopts Esther. The fact that she was able to conceal her Jewish heritage for Xerxes. The fact that she rises up and wins this beauty pageant. She goes from an orphan Jewish girl to queen of the Persian Empire. The fact that God put Mordecai nearby where you could overhear the assassination plot. The unbelievable reality that just through a sleepless night and a king calling for a journal to be read, he learns of Mordecai. All of these ways that God was at work delivering his people behind the scenes. And maybe what you experience in the same life is you go through a season where it seems like God is not mentioned and he's silent, but you need to know that that is not his absence also. And I would encourage you to spend some time looking back through your life and seeing some places where perhaps he seemed absent in the moment, but then you can see the way that he was at work in his hand. And so here's a question for you to wrestle with. Where is God working behind the scenes in your life? Where is he working behind the scenes and going unmentioned? And where can you look and discover and then bring him to the forefront and give him the glory for it? Second takeaway is this. You need someone who helps you focus on doing the right thing. Esther needed Mordecai to speak wisdom into her and say the most difficult thing. And he told her, it says, you cannot just fall in love with the comforts of the palace, but the right thing is you need to speak up for your people even when it's difficult. And she needed that outside encouragement to encourage her. That's what the word means, to give her courage to go see the king and do the right thing. You need something like that. So who in your life is a Mordecai? Who is your Mordecai? Who has that opportunity that you are willing to let them on the inside? You're willing to give them a fair hearing, a listening, even when it's something that you don't want to hear. And they say, I think there's some things in your life. I think there's some questions that you need to be wrestling with. I think there's some observations that I've made that you need to hear because I think it's going to cost you if you don't. That's what he's doing. So who's your Mordecai? And the last one is this. Your opportunities will tempt you to settle for a shadow mission. Your opportunities, the good things that come your way, will convince you to settle for a shadow mission. What's that shadow mission? That shadow mission is that default mission that takes us off of our mission that God has given us. And for Esther, again, it was so easy to fall in love with the opportunity and the comforts and the luxury of the palace and completely be insulated and separated from the misery that was going to fall her people. And it could have easily been, I will settle for the shadow mission of being eye candy for the king instead of a savior for my people. And we're the same way. Your opportunities, the good things that come your way, will entice you away from your God-given mission into a shadow mission. I've shared before, if you know me, you know that I didn't grow up with incredible athletic prowess. I'm not musically gifted. I had all these strikes, kind of against me, and the things that I thought, man, that would be so cool if. But at a young age, I realized that I had one superpower. I'm not afraid to get up in front of people and speak. Well, that became part of my shadow mission, though, because I started getting attaboys at a young age for getting up in front of youth group and giving Devo thoughts. And if I'm not real careful, what I'll start doing is I'll start chasing that, and I'll try to preach in a way that gets me a lot of attaboys. You understand the difference? Instead of saying the things that need to be said and that God's calling me to say, it's so much easier sometimes to say, well, if I say it this way, they'll like me. That's falling for the shadow mission. So what are your opportunities that you can either use for God or fall for a shadow mission? So here's the question. What might be God's purposes for your opportunities? What has God given you that He also has a purpose for that goes well beyond your comfort and your ego? That's what He's calling you to. I always want to end with, where do we see Jesus in this? And Jesus is all over the story, though He's not named or called out. But remember, Haman created a pole to hang. Haman created a pole to hang Mordecai on, but then the king says to Haman, no, we're going to hang you on that pole. Well, we serve the king that instead of hanging the guilty one on or the innocent one on, instead hung himself on that pole. This is Jesus right in the story. Look what Galatians says. Galatians 3:13 says this, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it's written, cursed is everyone who hung on a pole. He takes that on for you and for me. And just when Jesus could have fallen in love with the luxury and the comforts of the palace, instead, He steps down knowing that a cursed pole is His destination and steps into this world like an Esther, becoming the one that will save the people. And Philippians describes it this way, and I love this verse in chapter 2, and for many, these are going to be very familiar words, talking about Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to His own advantage. Rather, He made Himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted Him to the highest place and gave Him the name that is above every name, that the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus used His opportunities not for His own, but for such a time as this, when you and I were sinners, He laid down His life as the King. For such a time as this, what's God calling you to? Let me pray for you. Father, I thank You for Esther and Mordecai's story and their example. Father, I pray that You would do a work on each of us, that we would take whatever opportunities lie in front of us, whatever situation we find ourselves in right now, Father. Whether we are in the comfort, whether in the frustration, whatever it would be, Father, that we would see You working behind the scenes. Give us sight to see that, Father. And then help us realize that You have given each one of us a purpose in that, a God-given mission that You are calling us on. And for such a time as this, Father, May we be courageous. I pray for the courage of an Esther to fall on each of us in this moment. And Father, we are grateful for the King that gave his own life and was hung on the pole in our place. But not to stay there, but to rise again and be Lord of the universe. It's in his name we pray, Father. Together we say, amen.